I've been a video shooter for just under 10 years now, and I've always really loved Sony cameras and Panasonic cameras. But recently, the Panasonic S5 came out with some new features that I could not ignore from my video workflow. And so I decided to compare the A7 IV to the S5 And in this video, we're going to talk about the differences between these cameras from a video shooter's perspective. So we're not really going to talk much about photo stuff, but we're going to compare all the features of the A7 IV that are important for video and all the features of the Lumix S5 that are important for video shooters. And I also want to say that most of the features that we talk about with the S5 are applicable to the S5 II as well, minus just a couple small differences in terms of SSD recording and a few other things like that. I also want to say I have decided to switch from Sony over to Panasonic, but I really don't want to come across as biased. I'm just sharing my experience with both of these cameras. So if you're trying to decide if you should buy a Sony camera like the A7 IV or a Panasonic camera like the S5 which one is better for you as a video shooter? So let's get right into it. First and foremost, whenever you get both the cameras, they are both full frame cameras that can both shoot 4K video. But the main difference in the cameras is the S5 is a little bit newer than the A7 IV, and this supports resolutions all the way up to 6K. And what's crazy about the 6K that this camera is able to shoot is it actually uses the full sensor size. So you're able to get 3:2 aspect ratio 6K video, which is really useful for making vertical crops. But in terms of the overall ergonomics of both of the cameras, they're really similar size. If you hold them side by side, they weigh just about the same amount. And the main difference in terms of feel to me is that the S5 just has a slightly better feeling grip to it, although the A7 IV's grip is much improved over the previous cameras. Now, I will say I've gotten really used to the Sony cameras over the years, so all the buttons really made a lot of sense to me. One feature that the A7 IV has that I really liked was it has this knob on top that you can lock. I set this to ISO, so you're able to change your ISO and then lock it in place with the button on the top. And the S5 does not have that button. But they have about the same number of customizable buttons on them, and both cameras allow you to customize all the buttons to do pretty much whatever you want as well. One difference in between the doors on these is the A7 IV's doors on the side are a little harder to open, but they do stay open and you have to actually shut them all the way whenever you don't want to use those port doors on the side. On the S5 I find these rubber doors are a little harder to open, and they also kind of just fall shut easier too. So you have to be careful whenever you go to plug something in. I typically have to use a finger to hold the port open. Another weird thing is, for some reason, the mic jack on the side of the S5 is black. I wish that they made the mic jack red, because then you always know which one to plug it into without having to look at the symbol on it, which you can't always see in low light. I also like that on the Sony, the mic jack is just on its own little port, so it's really easy to find the mic jack and not to accidentally get it mixed up with the headphone port. As far as the rest of the buttons go though, there's about the same number of customizable buttons on both cameras. The S5 does have this extra customizable button on the front, which I actually map to be record. So if I'm having the camera in front of me, I can just reach forward and press record on the front very easily as well. Both of them do have a red record button on the top. The S5 is just completely red, and there's also a light that lights up beside the record button whenever you are recording. Both of these cameras are very adaptable, customizable, and they have tons of buttons you can set to use whatever you want. I did find the S5 made a lot of sense right out of the box when it was just new from the factory. One thing I really like about it is I have the top button set where you have to press it and hold it to change your exposure. So if you want to change your ISO, you hold the ISO button and then you can turn any of the dials and knobs that'll raise it or lower it. And it's the same for the white balance. It's so easy to change white balance on this camera compared to the Sony camera. Another difference in terms of switches is the Sony switch to turn it off and on is actually on the front with the shutter button, and on the Panasonic camera there's a separate switch a little bit farther back on it. I do like this separate switch because you never have to worry about accidentally bumping it with your index finger. It's just really out of the way there on the top. Now, I will say the S5 feels a lot slower than the Sony A7 IV does in terms of powering it on and just generally using it. Like if you press the playback button and you go to watch a picture or a video back after you shot it, it does take quite a bit longer for it to load on this than on the Sony. Both of these have about the same amount of battery life. You can also power both of them off of dummy batteries or USB-C. So I find that the power needs for both of these cameras feel about the same. One of the things I really like about the S5 though is it's a lot easier to change between the different focus modes. So this switch goes between manual focus, continuous focus, and single shot focus. On the Sony camera, you either have to assign a button to turn it off or on just by clicking it, or you have to go into a menu. So this is just a little bit more tactile. And there's a couple other small differences in terms of the buttons that the S5 has that I just think make a little bit more sense in the real world. They're just a little bit easier to use. But while we're on the topic of autofocus, the A7 IV definitely destroys the S5 IIX in terms of autofocus performance. You can just really trust this camera to nail it every time, no matter what autofocus mode you have it in. If you have it in face focus or eye focus mode during video, it's just gonna lock on the whole time. I've never had any issues with it pulsing in and out of focus. It also does pretty well in low contrast situations. The S5 IIX does finally have a newer updated autofocus system, but it's still just not quite as good as the Sony one is. Now, Panasonic did just release a newer firmware update. I'm using it on the camera I'm shooting with right now, and the autofocus does seem to be performing a little bit better, but on some of the other videos I shot before doing this firmware update, I would just notice every once in a while the focus would pulse in and out ever so slightly on the S5 IIX. So if you need the best autofocus performance possible, the A7 IV is still going to be a better option for you. Both of these cameras also offer IBIS, and it's always been known that Sony's IBIS is not the best. The Panasonic IBIS just does a lot better for me. I can shoot a lot of handheld B-roll with this and be really happy with how it turns out. And Panasonic's also added some more active modes for the IBIS as well. I haven't really gotten to use those much. And the A7 IV does have the active modes. Those work pretty well too, but either way, if you use active on either of these cameras, it is going to crop in a little bit. And while we're talking about crop, both of these cameras do shoot 4K 60. Both of them are going to crop into an APS-C sensor, so that is a downside to both of these. And there's no 4K 120 on either of these cameras as well, so both of these are limited in that regard. But while we're talking about 4K 60, let's talk about resolutions. I can't even list all the different resolutions that the S5 IIX supports. Just know this, it goes all the way up to 6K in that open gate shooting. There's a ton of different resolutions and codecs you can choose to shoot in. All intra recording. You can shoot in Apple ProRes using this if you're using an SSD to record. So there's just a ton of options with the S5 IIX. The A7 IV is going to top out at 4K recording, but you can still get really good 10-bit footage, and you can also record from either of these using the HDMI port. So the A7 IV does have a lot of great recording options, but the S5 IIX, the list is pretty much limitless. This camera is going to have every single kind of recording that you need and more than you need. And at first I thought, what's the big deal about 6K? 4K is more than enough. Once you start cropping in and out of 6K footage and seeing just how sharp it is, you're going to understand why you want it. One con to the S5 IIX though is there's no anti-aliasing filter, so you will notice moire in some situations. For me, it hasn't been a deal breaker yet, but I'm sure at some point I'll go to shoot a video and a pattern on a shirt will look terrible, and I'll wish I was shooting with the A7 IV. So if you're shooting in environments where moire can be an issue, you should probably lean towards the Sony camera. Another big difference between the cameras, both of them have dual SD card slots, but the Sony A7 IV has dual card slots that also support CF Express Type A, which I never found a need to use those cards, but that is nice that you have that available as a different recording medium. The S5 IIX, on the other hand, though, is able to record directly to SSDs. So I've been using this a lot with the Condor Blue Pro Blade handle, recording directly to SanDisk SSDs, and then I'm able to quickly offload onto my computer. Really love that workflow. You can also record in Apple ProRes if you're recording to an SSD as well. So that's just going to give you super nice files for working with on your computer. They're going to edit really smooth. Unfortunately, with the SSD recording, you're only able to record to one SSD at a time. So if you want to have a redundant recording, you're going to have to run an HDMI recorder with this if you're using it with the SSD recording. So that is one small con to using the SSD recording. But the SSD recording makes a lot of sense because you can get a 1 terabyte drive and an SSD handle for about $350 or so. A 1 terabyte CF Express Type A card or a 512 gigabyte V90 SD card, it's going to be way more money than that. So you're going to save quite a bit of money if you need to record large file sizes or a lot of files and you want to go with the SSD recording versus using SD cards or CF Express Type A cards. Also, in terms of filming videos, both of these have done well for me recording long form, but with the A7 IV, I have ran into a lot of issues with the camera just stopping the recording on me. So that would be really annoying because I'd be recording like this and the camera would just shut off and stop recording. The file would still be fine, but I would have to wait for the camera for a minute or two, start recording again, and then a couple minutes later, it's the same thing. It was never the overheating light on this necessarily, but it was just giving me a lot of issues. Now the S5 IIX has a built-in fan. You can see the little vents on the top of the viewfinder on it. And that built-in fan plus just all the other different cooling technologies that Panasonic has built into this camera allows you to record indefinitely with the S5 IIX. I've never had any issues with heat or not wanting to record. So this is a more reliable camera if you're shooting a lot of podcasts or long form interviews, because trust me, when you're recording a video, the last thing you want is for the camera to shut off on you. So I do really value that in the S5 IIX. Now let's talk color and noise. I don't have a ton of issues with the A7 IV in terms of noise, and with the Panasonic S5 IIX, I have no complaints with noise at all. I also have been shooting Sony for a long time. I know people don't like the Sony colors, but I got used to them. And the A7 IV, they did improve their color science quite a bit over the A7 III and the older cameras. But as soon as I got the S5 IIX and started using it, I just immediately noticed all the colors were more lifelike. It just looked a lot more natural, and it had a really good crisp look to it. So I do really like the S5 IIX colors, even though I don't dislike the Sony colors. Once I started using the Panasonic, I just immediately noticed it looked a lot more lifelike, in my opinion. Next, let's talk about lenses. So the Sony A7 IV uses the Sony E mount full frame lenses, and the S5 IIX uses the L mount, which there's actually this L mount alliance. So Sigma, Leica, and Panasonic all make L mount lenses, and some of the newer DJI cameras and the Blackmagic cameras are also going to use L mount as well. So that's really nice that your lenses will be compatible with multiple camera brands. Now, the Sony cameras have been out for longer. E-mount's an older mount than L-mount is, so there are more third-party options, and there's also multiple generations of some of the lenses too. So you can get the 70-200 G Master Mark I quite a bit cheaper than you're able to get the Panasonic 70-200 f2.8 lens. So you will be able to save a little bit of money and have more options when you buy lenses for the Sony cameras. Now, that being said, Panasonic has some really cool lenses as well. I shot real estate for years, and Panasonic has the 14-28 millimeter f4 to 5.6, which I have, and it's a really cool lens that Sony doesn't necessarily have the same exact lens. They do have some of the other Sigma lenses and some similar ones, but I've been able to find every single lens I need for the Panasonic cameras. But there's not as many of the Pro Series lenses for the Lumix cameras as there are for the Sony, meaning the G Master lenses you can get on the Sony cameras. But I've been using a lot of the S primes. We're shooting on the 35 f1.8 S prime right now, and that lens is just as good as the Sony FE 35mm f1.8 lens. And all the S primes are about the same size and weight, so they all balance really well on gimbals, and they also have minimal focus breathing on them. So those lenses definitely work really well with video. Next, let's talk about audio capture. For me, having an XLR interface is super important, and on the Sony camera, they have the K3M. You can also get the XLR H1 handle from the FX3 or FX30. Put a cage on the A7 IV, and then you can get an adapter plate. It works great. And then on the Lumix camera, they don't have a top handle audio interface, but they do have a slide-on hot shoe audio interface called the DMW XLR1. It works well. I'm using it right now to record audio with my Sennheiser microphone. So both of these cameras you can get XLR in. It works great. You also have the hot shoe on both of them for using third-party microphones. But the big con that the Panasonic camera has is they don't have a slide-on hot shoe microphone like Sony does. Sony's got 3 or 4 different microphones now, like the B1M, the B10. I think there's the M1 as well. So you can just slide your microphone directly onto the camera and have audio going through the hot shoe, which is really nice not to have a cable on the side. So I really wish Panasonic had one of those microphones. And DJI also just put out an adapter for the Sony cameras using the DJI Wireless 2, so you can record directly into the hot shoe as well. But on the flip side, Panasonic is known for having much better preamps than Sony. So if you're going to use something like a Rode video mic, that's going to sound a lot better using the Panasonic camera than using the Sony camera. So if you already have on-camera microphones you want to use, the Panasonic is going to be a better option. And they also have a really good limiter built into the camera too. Another really cool thing is if you use that XLR interface, you can also record using the built-in mic on the camera. You can also record in 4-channel mode using the camera, using an external mic and using the internal mic at the same time. Some of those features are really nice. So the audio on both of these cameras is a draw in my opinion, although I do really wish they had those Sony MyShoe mics for the Panasonic cameras. So now that we've talked about all the different features of these cameras for video, we got to start talking about price. The A7 IV retails for $2,500 and the S5 IIX retails for $2,200. And you can also get the S5 II for $2,000. And Panasonic has been doing a lot of really interesting rebates and sales where you can bundle lenses and they get ridiculously cheap. So Panasonic is definitely going to save you money over Sony in the long run. So should you go to the Sony A7 IV or the Panasonic S5 IIX? I think it kind of depends on what you're looking for. If the most important thing to you is autofocus and lens selection, then I would go for the Sony A7IV because the autofocus on this camera is just phenomenal. And in my opinion, this is also a more enjoyable camera to use for photography as well. I said we're not going to talk much about that, but it's just a little bit more enjoyable shooting pictures on the Sony than it is on the Panasonic. But if you want video codec options, if you want to shoot in 6K, if you want to try out the new L-mount lenses, if you want what is known by many people as a better color science, then this camera is really hard to pass up because it honestly has such a great look to it. I've just been really impressed with the look I've been able to get out of the footage I've been shooting with the S5 IIX. But in my opinion, the S5 IIX just crushes it in terms of all the features for video shooters that make it really hard for someone like me who primarily shoots video to pass up over the Sony A7IV. So if you have any other thoughts about this topic of buying the A7IV or buying the Lumix S5 IIX, leave a comment down below because I'd love to read them. Also, ask me any questions you have about both of these camera systems. I'm happy to talk about it. Like this video, subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on any upcoming content. Be sure to check out the links in the description below for all my favorite video gear.